time and again in the history of this country, 356 has been misused by all regimes. Steps for the restoration of democracy. Where are those steps? In fact, the steps are just to the contrary, the reverse of it. Destruction of democracy. People are not taken into account. Their views are not taken into account. You arrogate to yourself the powers of the state. You arrogate to yourself the federal principle, social pluralism and pluralistic democracy, which forms the basic structure of our constitution, demands that the judicial review of the proclamation under 356 is not only an imperative necessity, but a stringent duty, and the exercise of power under the said provision is confined strictly for the purpose and to the circumstances mentioned therein, and none else. That's very important. The purpose of 356 is to restore democracy. That is why this is very important. So you must interpret whatever the actions of the government are in the context of that purpose under 356. It also requires that the material on the basis of which the power is exercised is scrutinized circumspectly. In this connection, we may refer to Dr. Ambedkar, what he had to say in reply to the apprehensions expressed by other honorable members of the Constituent Assembly in this context, which also brings out the concerns weighing in the mind of honorable members. In regard to the general debate which has taken place, in which it has been suggested that these articles are liable to be abused, I may say that I do not altogether deny that there's a possibility of these articles being abused or employed for political purposes. So this is not something that I am saying on my own, Madad. This was envisaged. But that objection applies to every part of the Constitution, which gives power to the center to override the provinces. In fact, I share the sentiments expressed by my honorable friend, Mr. Gupte, yesterday, that the proper thing we ought to expect is that such articles will never be called into operation, and that they would remain a dead letter. If at all they are brought into operation, I hope the President, who is endowed with these powers, will take proper precautions before actually suspending the administration of provinces. I hope the first thing that he will do would be to issue a mere warning to a province that has heard that things were not happening in the way in which they were intended to happen in the Constitution. If that warning fails, the second thing for him to do will be to order an election, allowing the people of the province to settle matters by themselves. It is only when these two remedies fail that he would resort to this article. It is only in those circumstances he would resort to this article. I do not think we could then say that these articles were imported in vain or that the President had acted wantonly. Time and again in the history of this country, 356 has been misused by all regimes. That was never the intent. And now, in this, in changing the structure of this Constitution as applicable to Jammu and Kashmir, it has crossed all limits. See what happens. 20th of June, Malaj, 19th of June, sport withdrawn. 20th of June, governor says, and suspended animation. 20th of November, an attempt is made. Well, there is some ambiguity in that, to form a government. 21st November, dissolution. Can't be done without the aid and advice. Then, after 21st November, 19th December. Then 356. Then 3rd of July. Extended. Then 5th of August. Where are the steps for the restoration of democracy? Where are those steps? In fact, the steps are just to the contrary, the reverse of it. Destruction of democracy. People are not taken into account. Their views are not taken into account. You arrogate to yourself the powers of the state. You arrogate to yourself the powers of the legislature. Parliament becomes the spokesperson of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And you express the wishes of the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly through Parliament, when the Constitution requires you to take the views of the state. of the legislature, of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, who gave to themselves the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. Everything that is done under 356 is contrary to the basic principles of both federalism and democracy, and to the principle of constitutional morality.
Yes, please.
Then 108 minutes. The further equally important question that arises in this context is whether the president, when he issued the proclamation under 356, would be justified in removing the government in power or dissolving the legislative assembly, and thus in exercising all the powers mentioned in subclauses A, B, and C of clause 1 of Article 356, whatever the nature of the situation or degree of the failure of the constitutional machinery. A strong contention was raised that situations of the failure of the constitutional machinery may be varied in nature and extent, and hence measures to remedy the situation may differ both in kind and degree. It would be a disproportionate and unreasonable exercise of power if the removal of government or dissolution of assembly is ordered when what the situation required was, for example, only assumption of some functions or powers of the state, government of the state, or of anybody or authority in the state under 356(1)(a). This is not the only power that you can exercise under 356. There are incremental steps to be taken. This is not a guillotine provision. And it's temporary, to say the least. So unless your lordships come down heavily, that 356 is not meant for this purpose. The excessive use of power also amounts to illegal, irrational, and mala fide. So your lordships will have to determine, was this not an excessive use of power? And per se, it would be illegal, mala fide, and irrational. Hence, it is urged that the doctrine of proportionality is relevant in this context and has to be applied in such circumstances. To appreciate, that's why I said, in normal circumstances, dissolution would never happen. First, the assembly would be suspended, be in suspended animation. Attempts would be made to form a government. In the meantime, you exercise president's rule. When you realize that it's just not possible at all, it's then at that stage that you dissolve the assembly and order elections. Now you've dissolved the assembly. When did you dissolve it? On 21st of November 2018. And we are where? In August 2023. Was that meant to be, under 356?